Israel approved the largest land grab in the occupied West Bank in more than 30 years. There's a settlement tracking group that shows that this is literally the single biggest seizure since the Oslo Accords of 1993, which marks the beginning of the so-called modern peace process. Now, this appropriation includes 5 square miles of land in the Jordan Valley, and it links 2 already existing Israeli settlements, creating a solid block near the Jordan border. Now, the move is problematic for lots of reasons. It's illegal. It's unethical. But as a practical matter, because some of y'all would say that's just philosophical. I think you're wrong, but you might say that's just philosophical. The issue is that the move actually undermines the likelihood of a Palestinian state. It undermines the likelihood of a peace agreement. It undermines the likelihood of an end to the most horrific military incursion in Gaza in modern history. Settlement expansion in the West Bank is seen by Palestinians, and rightfully so, as a barrier to any real peace agreement. As long as settlements are there and expanding, it is very difficult to convince anybody that Israel is operating in good faith. And for that reason, this must be decried. This must be critiqued. This must be challenged. This must be ended. If we're ever going to get anywhere close, and I mean close, I'm not even talking about there, just close to a Palestinian state and to true justice in the region. Now, I like to bring people on there to tell me why I'm wrong. I'm still going to be right, but I like to bring people on to tell me why I'm wrong. Let me bring on Adela Cojab. It's the largest land grab in more than 3 decades. Settlement expansion is growing even as the Gaza war is happening. How can anyone justify that? How is that okay?
Yeah, so there's a couple of questions. So the first thing I will say is that I'm not a representative of the Israeli government. I'm an activist for Israel's existence, and I am based in the U.S. I'm Mexican, so there's a lot of things in play. So I can't speak for the Israeli government. But if we're saying why would they do this, there's a couple of reasons why. The first is strategic. When it comes to strategy, if you look at the West Bank, while everything has been unfolding in Gaza, at the same time at the West Bank, there have been uprisings as well. Not exactly uprisings, but the IDF checkpoints, for example, that everyone loves to critique, have stopped multiple vehicles that have dozens of grenades and things like that going into mainland Israel. So everything that's been done in the West Bank, at least in the eyes of Israel, has been for self-protection. So why has this block been formed? It's because if you know the West Bank, you know that the settlements exist in pockets. The communities exist in pockets, and they're, of course, divided. So this was a way to unite them, to make sure that there's more logistical availability for protection when it comes to the communities that currently exist in the West Bank.
So that makes sense to me, except for a couple of reasons. First, do you begin from the premise that the settlements are illegal?
It depends on the settlement. If they've been established after Oslo, sure. If they were established before, at that point, it was no. At that point, no, because if you look at the West Bank itself, we can call it occupied territory, but the way that countries and entities come into existence is through a treaty or by war. Of course, the West Bank was originally allotted to be the Palestinian state in 1947, along with Gaza, which was, of course, rejected, led to the War of Independence, or the Nakba, depending on which side you look at it, where, again, it remained under Jordanian control, if we're talking about the West Bank specifically. It remained under Jordanian control until 67. After 67, it was taken by Israel. And that is how war works. That's how states come into being. But it was left in this kind of quasi-state. For example, the Golan Heights was annexed immediately, so no one really contests the sovereignty of Israel over the Golan Heights, as opposed to Gaza and the West Bank, taken from Jordan and Egypt respectively, remained in this quasi-state. So all the settlements that came after, I would not consider illegal, because at that point, it had been taken by Israel. And then after Oslo, then there were conversations of turning the West Bank into an independent Palestinian country. That's when really it should have ceased. So it depends on the settlement, and there's, again, like Area A, Area B, Area C, and each of those have different constitutionalities, if we can call it that, or legalities when it comes to their settlement.
So I'm actually glad to talk to you, because it's rare that I get to talk to people. I still think you're completely wrong, but cool. at least we can have a conversation that's somewhat informed. the first thing I would disagree with you on, this idea of acquisition of land by force violates numerous forms of international law. The idea that we can just take land because we win the war and not give it back, or the idea that we can indefinitely occupy land after war, stands in sharp contrast to, I mean, even I would argue the most hawkish person on these issues would concede that we shouldn't do it. I mean, typically what people argue is that Israel will, you know, the people who I think are more reasonable on this will say, yeah, well, Israel shouldn't be doing this, but there's a security reason that prevents them from giving it back. Not that we acquired this land and it's ours because might made right. I mean, the whole kind of post-World War logic and the formation of the nation state was to prevent that. But then beyond that, when we look specifically at the UN resolutions, you know, and I'm thinking about 338 and 242 in particular, one of the conditions under those was a return to the lands that were taken, was the return of the lands taken in the 67 war, right? So
Yeah.
if you're supposed to give back the land in the 67 war, and Israel's doing the exact opposite, and I know you would agree that it says you're supposed to give back the land from the 67 war, then to me the question is, how can we square that circle? How can we say in a treaty, to use your language, or UN resolution more specifically, this land is supposed to be given back, and then against the backdrop of a broader premise of you can't just take land by force anymore. That's what empires do. That's not what nation states do. And then say that we can do it. It's somewhat rhetorical, but I'd love your response to that. But
Of course.
I think the bigger question for me, and is, even if you and I didn't see eye to eye completely on that, and we just looked at the post-Oslo moment, to your point, and this is night school, so we try to give education to the audience at the same time. You reference A, B, and C. For the audience that doesn't know, areas A, B, and C are after Oslo, one of the ways that the peace process was supposed to result in a two-state solution was beginning in this phase of dividing the West Bank into three territories. Area A, which would be Palestinian run and administered. There's places like Ramallah, for example. Then you had Area B, which would be, it'd be a split between Israel and Palestine in terms of how security oversight happened versus how it was administered. And then you had Area C, which makes up a large chunk, the overwhelming majority of those three areas. And that's where a place like Khalil or Hebron would be.